Hi, this is Benjamin Fogel, contributing editor at Jacobin magazine, and today we're very lucky to be talking to René Rojas, who is the author of a new piece for Catalyst called Chile's Resurgent Left, and also a assistant professor at SUNY Binghamton. Hi, René.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So let's get right into it. So, without further ado, we have to break down a little bit of context for our viewers. So, can you just basically break down the entire fortunes of Chilean democracy from the post-Pinochet period to 2019, where the story really kicks off?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Chile is an interesting case in Latin America because, as I think most people who follow the region know, it's considered, widely considered a huge success for it. It's really a poster child for democratic neoliberal development. All this began, as you mentioned, in 1990 when the country transitioned from an authoritarian military dictatorship under Pinochet to a new democratic regime. Now, the transition from authoritarianism to democracy was key because, in many ways, it locked in place some characteristics, right, which are vital to understanding the Chilean case. In the first place, what it did with the settlement, right, to return to democracy, did was that it enshrined, pro-market neoliberal growth model for the country. And it did so really by shaping the politics of the country. And there were two key components there. The first was that in order to defend, right, this free market order and elite interest, it put in place, it kind of engineered, right, a set of institutions that put in place an oligarchic political class that shared power, a center left that dominated politics. In fact, the center left coalition called the Concertación, composed of the Christian Democrats and the Socialist parties mainly, didn't lose an election between 1990 and 2010. But it was that coalition, along with the center right coalition, a liberal kind of right, that dominated politics, and it did so largely through the electoral system that was put in place, where the two largest parties pretty much took all representation and had all the political power in the country. So that was the first key component to the democratic political regime that managed neoliberalism in Chile. The second one, though, which is as crucial, was the demobilization of collective action, of popular movement, of protest movements from below. This was a deliberate effort on the part of the new political class to cut ties with, to make sure that its parties, its institutions, in no way supported, right, organized working and popular sectors. And so those are the two key ingredients that shaped politics of the country. And combined, what they led to was what's considered the success story. High growth rates, the highest growth rates, for about 15 years in Latin America. That in turn led to a reduction in poverty, right? And all this together meant that it was a pretty stable society, in spite of the fact that it was one of the most commodified societies in the world. It managed to secure political stability and avoid social unrest. Now, all of that began unraveling in the late aughts, approximately. By this point, this model that had been established was really starting to experience symptoms of exhaustion. And that was first, I think, manifest in the rise of new protest movements. And two in particular deserve mention: a student movement in 2006 and 2007 that really, really shook socialist Michelle Bachelet's first presidency. And around the same time, a wildcat strike among contracted miners in copper, which is Chile's main industry. 4 or 5 years later, a larger student movement exploded on the scene, and that was the university student movement in 2011, 2012, that really, really, for the first time in the post-transition period, put kind of mass social movement politics on the scene. Um, that really opened the floodgates, as it were, for other types of mass organizing and mass movements. The retirees movement called No Más AFP, which stands for No More AFP, which are the privatized pension funds, grew to hundreds of thousands and up to a million participants when they would go out in March. And then the young women's feminist movement as well, which also could bring together hundreds of thousands, even millions of people onto the streets. In the meantime, what was happening, and this has really, I think, gotten less attention, both in the press but also among critical scholars, is that there was a revitalization of the labor movement. And we should have kept our eye on this. After all, one of the things that sparked this new cycle of protests was the miners' movement of 2007. But the main thing to note is that for 10 years, beginning around 2007, there's this huge resurgence of industrial activity and industrial protest. And then within that, what's also noteworthy is the fact that there are key sectors of the working class that were some of the most active, some of the most militant, and they're precisely workers in Chile's strategic industries, in copper, which brings in, represents a vast majority of Chile's exports, a huge chunk of GDP, and also important were the dock workers, who went on a series of wildcat strikes in the mid-teens, right? So all of that was started happening, excuse me, about 10, 20 years into the democratic transition.
Okay, so let's jump forward a bit to 2019. So from 2019, really until the present, where we now have a left-wing government, we have a constitutional reform process. We saw a series of explosions in Chile, almost unexpected.
Yeah.
But we've seen a series of explosions, like massive protest movements from Egypt to Brazil, across the world, but often they resulted in right-wing outcomes or amorphous apolitical movements. But something different happened in Chile. We saw a sort of concrete political form emerge from these. So what happened from 2019 really until the election last year, I believe?
Yeah, a lot happened, and it is totally, totally upended Chile's political system, as you know. And one thing I didn't describe was the actual uprising. So that 10-year cycle of protests eventually kind of exploded into a generalized uprising and rebellion in October of 2019. And that set in motion, right, a series of events which have now culminated in two things. The election of Gabriel Boric, a left-wing, might call him a new radical or representative of Chile's new left in December of last year, and also a constituent assembly, which has written a draft proposal, which was presented last week to the public, and which will be voted on in a plebiscite in September. So, as you know, it's important to understand how this mass rebellion that erupted somewhat spontaneously. It was not predicted, was not anticipated, was certainly not called for by any of the new movements that were on the scene. How that ends up culminating, right, in these new forms of politics and the election of a very left reform government in Chile. And I think that's where what I had started to mention earlier really comes into play. The old political system, the old party system, really disintegrated, right, to the point where the old center left and the old, center right that had shared power back and forth lost pretty much all legitimacy, all credibility, and lost their mass support. Very importantly, in the meantime, a new left was formed. It was first formed, in fact, as a coalition in 2017, or leading up to the 2017 elections, as a broad front, or Frente Amplio, of these new left parties, very small at the time, but they broke through with about 20% of the vote. Many of these parties had been established and led by militants of the 2011-2012 student movement, including Boric himself and other key members of his cabinet right now. So that was an important development that allowed for the discontent, allowed for the unrest to be channeled in this left direction. There has been, of course, a rise of a new kind of very harsh, reactionary Bolsonaro type right in Chile. But and in fact, its candidate Cast, Jose Antonio Cast, which broke from the center-right coalition to form this, more extreme right, won the first round elections at the end of last year, in November, I believe, of 2021. But the fact that these new social movements, these new activists and organizers had come together to create a left coalition, a left alliance, right, that was able to win over and channel a lot of the discontent with Chile's neoliberal system, I think was pivotal in allowing for, for now, a resolution to the crisis in this more progressive left-wing direction. So that when the protests and the rebellion was at its height, right, about 2 to 3 weeks into the mass uprising of the fall of 2019, the key figures of this new left, including Boric himself centrally, were able to wrest from the government and the entire old political class a massively important concession, which was reviled at the time, heavily criticized, particularly from his left. But what it was an agreement to hold a plebiscite to ask Chileans if they wanted to rewrite the constitution. Now, of course, Chileans have been clamoring for a new constitution since the return to democracy in 1990, because what we had was kind of forcefully inherited constitution imposed by Pinochet, the 1980 constitution. And so when the plebiscite was held in 2020, the public came out overwhelmingly for a new constitution and voted in the plebiscite to hold elections for a constituent assembly. So I think to wrap up, the fact that these left activists, social movement activists, right, had the clarity and the vision to actually found, right, an alliance of political parties that would dispute power and fight for central state power, on the one hand, was crucial in all of this. And secondly, the fact that most people who mobilized during the cycle of protests leading up to 2019 and during the rebellion itself recognized this as an option, realized how important it was to not only protest and cause disruption on the street, but also to channel the discontent into competition for state power. I think those things were crucial.
We'll return to the subject of the Constituent Assembly and the movements that took this demand up a bit later. But I'm going to ask you a sort of more general question, but you can relate to Chile specifically, which is, according to my analysis at least, across Latin America, we've seen in the last few years a return of the left. Many predicted the pink tide had fell through and receded, but from old countries with traditional lefts, such as Bolivia, to countries which have never really had the left in power, or at least haven't had for a significant amount of time, such as Mexico and Colombia, we've had new left governments being elected, or center-left governments. So part of my analysis, at least, indicates that part of this is due to the fact that the center-right, as well as the far-right, in the cases of people like Jair Bolsonaro, have been unable to govern effectively. They've been unable to offer a model of growth, offer a political compact or mode of governance that is stable. Can you explain to us, in the context of Chile, what happened in terms of this political establishment? Why did the government uh, fall apart? Why did this order, so much praised by American international press, the Pinochet neoliberal miracle, fall through and the political order collapse?
Yeah, well, there's a lot in what you bring up in that question, and I'll try to take it piece by piece. Um, in terms of the more general regional outlook, um, it's really interesting. I think it's correct to say that centrist and right-wing forces have demonstrated, right, an inability to govern neoliberalism, and they lost legitimacy. They lost, as I said earlier, any kind of broad popular appeal, and many of them were um, taken down through mass mobilizations or voted out of office through the ballot box. In my estimation, that has more to do with the broad political class that emerged throughout the region in what, this might be overgeneralizing, but what you might consider the post-authoritarian period. So after the 80s into the 90s, right? Centrist forces um, returned to power, democratic forces, right, with the task of now governing this kind of extreme market orders throughout society, and doing so democratically in ways that ensured governability and profits. And of course, they weren't able to do so for a number of reasons. And I think the Chilean case helps illustrate um, why they weren't they didn't manage to secure, right, stability and governability, if you want to use those terms. The Chilean case is interesting because, as I said, growth expanded, very high rates. Poverty was reduced as well. Coming out of the dictatorship, Chile had like a 40% poverty rate. It was reduced to close to single digits, depending on what counts you use. But at the same time, what happened is that you had just enormous growth also in inequality. And Chile and other Latin American countries became even more unequal than they had been. The region is historically the most unequal region in the world. But under pro-market orders throughout the region, inequality in most of these countries grew enormously. So there's that. What did that mean? It meant that for huge chunks of the population, right, who depended on the market to get by, to secure basic goods, um, healthcare, housing, education, etc. They faced high levels of insecurity and inability to do so. Large chunks of the population, right? And that all, I think, came to a head in the teens, after the Great Recession and everything that's come since then, has really, really, I think, um, placed enormous barriers on the political class's inability to keep on producing growth, keep on generating economic expansion, right? And so those things mixed in a really explosive way, and I think Chile is the best example that illustrates that. So that at that point, this kind of centrist, moderate governance scheme has completely exhausted itself and has shown itself that it's incapable of continuing to reduce growth, continuing to give people decent, relatively decent paying jobs, etc. So that, I think, that's the very generalized way of looking at it. And I'm using the Chilean example to exemplify it. But one of the results, of course, of earlier rebellions and earlier upsurges and popular mobilization was, throughout the region, the emergence of what scholars and journalists and others call pink tide regimes. These kind of semi-populist reform regimes, and I think most exemplified by Chavez in Venezuela and Morales and the Mas in Bolivia.
So if we're going to talk about the pink tide governments, and again, we're seeing a sort of second wave in some of these political forces have emerged anew and returned to power, and we might be on the verge of, for instance, electoral victory of the PT. In Brazil, we've also seen Mexico and Colombia, as I mentioned earlier, elect left-wing governments for basically the first time in their history, or at least since the 1930s in Mexico's case. So you have a particular analysis which you produced in Catalyst in previous essays, as well as this essay on the pink tide. What makes the Chilean government and the Chilean
Yeah.
opportunities, which you argue has better strategic potential than the sort of classical pink tide governments of Morales and Chavez, what makes this possible? What are the differences between the sort of classical mode of pink tide governance and what's been happening in Chile?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really kind of motivated me and pushed me to think of what's distinctive about the Chilean case and whether there is potential, right, for a new type of left to emerge in Chile as compared to the lefts that emerge in pink tide countries. And I think that the way I approach it, right, is to look at two things. To look at what was happening in those countries relative to the recent developments in Chile in terms of their party systems, their political systems, but also, right, you might call that a kind of from above look at the situation, but also what was happening in terms of the composition of the sectors, the vast popular sectors, toiling sectors that mobilized, right, against the old governing regimes. In the case of the pink tide, two things are key, I think. In terms of the party systems, they really underwent a rapid and abrupt collapse, right? And it leaves a total void almost, so that new political forces, like the MAS in Bolivia, like all the groups and kind of proto-parties that coalesce around Chavez in Venezuela, they're able to take almost full control of government and of many state institutions. That happens that's what's happening in terms of the governing institutions in those countries. With respect to the popular sectors that mobilized, right, and organized these cycles, these waves of protests that brought these new forces to power, because of the antecedent decades of pro-market, right, reform, right, and the effects of these kind of restructuring of the economies, most of the popular sectors that backed, right, the new left in these countries came from the informal sector. Really very marginal forces in terms of their position in the economy, their position in key institutions of these societies. They're peripheral in many respects, right? People who toiled on the street, scraping by, people from small towns or the peripheries of the cities, right? They were key backers of the pink tide government. So what that meant in my analysis is that these new left populists are thrust into power. They have, almost full control of state institutions, right? And they respond to their backers, who are primarily the constituents behind them, primarily from the informal sector, right? And so they immediately enter into a clientelistic relationship with them, where they use the rents of commodities, which at the time started to increase on the global market, to redistribute income and revenue down to their informal supporters. That's not quite the situation in Chile. And the difference between what we saw in Chile in recent years, juxtaposed to what we saw in the pink tide, I think is the key to figuring out whether or not what we're witnessing is the emergence of a new and more promising left in Chile. So if you take each of those components one by one, you can see what I mean. In terms of the old ruling order, the old partisan system, party system, right? While it has undergone a process of disintegration, it didn't fully and suddenly unravel the way it did in many pink-tide countries. What that means is that the new ruling coalition, which is this new left represented by Boric and his cohort, in alliance with the old left, and I neglected to mention the old left earlier in this interview, and by that I really mean the Communist Party, right, which has a long tradition of representing the working class in Chile, which had been highly marginalized, but has experienced somewhat of a comeback, right? What it means is that when this coalition comes together, right now, again, between Frente Amplio and the Communist Party, called Apruebo Dignidad in Chile, which came together to fight for in the constituent elections. What it means is that it's facing contestation in the state against forces that are still around, that it really has to do battle with, unlike, let's say, Chavez in Venezuela, right? That means that the coalition itself is still cohering, and its position within the state is still being competed for. That's happening at that level. In terms of the popular constituencies, right, that rebelled in this mass uprising, and that had been organizing for about a decade up until then, and that backed Apruebo Dignidad in the constituent elections, and then Boric in the first and second round of the presidential elections, right? They're actually characterized a bit differently. They're comprised of, yes, it's true, many informalized sectors of the working class who occupy marginal and peripheral positions in the economy and in key social institutions. But as I said earlier, right, they're also, this new left is also backed by a revitalized labor movement and reorganized unions that have acquired a new confidence, that have been striking, that have been calling for, sector-wide strikes in the case of mining, in the case of, for instance, the dock workers that I mentioned, but also in some public employee sectors as well, right? They've really taken the initiative, and they have, I think, right, compared to the key popular constituencies behind some of the main pink-tide governments, they possess a structural power which the mostly informal workers that back Chavez and Morales didn't and don't possess today. So I think the combination that we're seeing, and it's still, we have to see how it ends up playing out, right? But of a new left alliance that is still cohering, that's still battling for positions in the state, right? And therefore is trying to redefine key state institutions of economic and social governance on the one hand, and its popular sector backers that aren't just in the informal peripheral poor, right, that are demanding redistribution of rents. Instead, they're also comprised of this new labor movement, which is demanding more or at least has the ability to demand more structural reforms. I think we're in for a more promising mix, right, that could chart the path for a more successful 21st century socialist left, if you will.
We'll return to the subject of the prospect for Chile later, but I want to ask in a little bit more detail something you bring up, and which maybe is some of the strategic lessons for those of us who are outside of Chile. In the Chilean case, we have a very interesting United Front in that it, apart from the strategic layers of the working class and this new labor movement, we also have a revitalized feminist movement, which has been able to win successful reforms. We have a student movement, which began as a sort of anti-austerity movement, and that has been able to sort of bridge the gap between the campus and wider society and sort of unite together in a way which we see these sort of divisions among these different movements and the working class in Europe and the United States, for instance. So what was this process they came together? Was this the product of hard strategic work? Was this something which was unexpected? And for instance, I mean, could you point out the connection to, say, Chile's anti-abortion struggle and how this sort of emerged together with an anti-austerity struggle and the revitalization of labor in a way that was able to build a winning electoral coalition?
It's interesting. I think the ingredients are in place, and that is due in large part to tactical and strategic decisions made along the way. But I think I'd be overstating. I'd be way too optimistic if, if I argued that these different forces have already cohered into, right, a well-coordinated um, block, right, with a unified strategic vision. It's not there yet. But I think what was key in the Chilean case, right, was that representatives of these new mass movements, students, the feminist movement, which, as you say, is probably the largest in the world in many ways. Um,
Can you just expand on that a little bit?
sure, sure. So, and there's a connection between the student movement and the feminist movement. The student movement that mobilized in 2011 and 2012, right, was, as I said, the first mass movement that Chile witnessed in the post-transition period. It's kind of in decline right now, or somewhat dormant. But what it did was that it helped spark the rise of other mass movements. Um, One that doesn't get mentioned often is the a new uh, public workers kind of mobilization, mostly teachers. A lot of these students went on to become teachers. They organized in their unions, but also they had a very, very important influence on a new layer of militant young women that start organizing on campuses around 2018 um, against narrower demands, very important, but narrower demands against discrimination, against sexual harassment and assault, right? But then it just explodes, it massifies over 2019 and 2020, where these coordinating bodies, right, start to gain much wider membership. Um, these collectives, I should say, these feminist collectives start to appeal to a wider membership and then start coordinating, right? And so they launch these nationwide days of action and during those years, to the point where I think in 2020, 2 million feminists, not all women, men as well, but mostly women, mobilized on the streets, right? They are largely connected to, not in a very tight organic way, somewhat still loosely, but very much connected to this new left, Boric's generation, right? And so what I think was key there, that not only the leadership of these new mass movements decided to compete for state power and to form this alliance with the Communist Party, which to me is just, it's a historic development, right? Because it brings together the key components of a new left that had been in the wilderness in Chile for 50 years, right? But not only do their kind of more political representatives and cadre decide to compete for state power and influence in governing institutions, the movements themselves, with some trepidation, with disagreements, right, also um, decide to back these new coalitions. They don't do it evenly, and as I said, they do it with, fraught with tension, and that led to a lot of damaging developments and episodes. For instance, in the Constituent Assembly, where there was the lack of coordination among the new social movements and representatives, but a large chunk of them did decide that, again, competing for state power, backing this new political coalition, was instrumental to winning the reforms that they demanded.
This brings me to a sort of interesting, sort of unique part of this Chilean experience, which is the Constituent Assembly itself. So more often than we're not, we've seen center-left or left governments take power and deal with the limitations imposed on them by the existing political system and the constitutional order, which has often emerged, particularly in Latin America, under the supervision of military dictatorships or a ruling class which is managing a transition to democracy. Brazil strikes me as a perfect example. But in this case, before we have the election of a left government, which we'll return to after this, we have a massive, massive movement which successfully wins the right to change the constitution, to produce something new. So, in terms of less strategic possibilities, particularly for those who in the United States have been used to the same sort of inadequate and depressing document that's been maintained for 200 plus years, that you have the ability before you take power to really manage to propose a new set of limits and visions on taking state power, which is a constitutional reform process. So what happened there, and what is the current state of the constitutional reform process, constituent assembly process, as it's called?
Yeah, what happened was that as I said, just to go back a bit, and then I'll take up the thread in terms of more recent developments. During the uprising of 2019, October 2019, the political class, I have to emphasize, at the time, the center right was in power, but the uprising wasn't just against the center right government. It was against the power sharing regime, in which the center right ruled alongside the center left. I mean, these are opposing coalitions, but they kind of alternate in shared power and roughly agreed on policy route. And the dominant force there was the center left. So the rebellion really was not just against the Piñera, the Sebastián Piñera center right government. It was against the entire post-authoritarian neoliberal regime. So I just want to emphasize that, and very clearly so. So the rebellion ends up being kind of uncontainable. The fury, the rage, right, just would not die down. They send in the cops, send in the military to the streets, brutal repression, right? Hundreds of people lost their eyesight, etc. As the military and the police were shooting directly at people's faces to try to get people off the streets, and they can't. That just the rebellion would not die down. People would not leave the streets, and that's when Boric, who at that point was in Congress, right, helps broker this agreement, which is really a concession by the entire post-authoritarian political class to say, look, the rebellion, we don't know how to end it. Why don't we hold a plebiscite where we ask Chileans, do you want a new constitution? Everyone understood at the time that although, the rebellion was spontaneous, demands were mixing in a somewhat amorphous way, there was general agreement on the fact that people wanted a new constitution. I don't really like this term too much, but it's a new social contract, if you will, that would move things away from this market-governed social system, right? And so that happens in November 15th, I believe, of 2019. As I mentioned earlier, Boric gets heavily criticized by the left, by the party that becomes, his coalition partner, the communists, for instance, and by other sectors, even within the Frente Amplio alliance and within his own party, right? Heavily criticized because many people viewed that, one, the entire regime could have been toppled through mass mobilization on the street. Secondly, which I find to be a more persuasive critique, which I just, was speaking recently to activists who were, on the streets at the time, they felt that the agreement was fine, right? But that at the time, this new left could have won other concessions, right? Like immediately getting the government at the time to, let's say, abolish chunks of student debt, right? Or something else policy-wise could have been won. In any event, the agreement is made. Elections are held. They're delayed because of the pandemic. They're held the following year, and Chileans overwhelmingly, right, by 8-2 ratio, vote not only to rewrite the Constitution, but there are two questions in the plebiscite, also to elect, right, an entire new set of representatives who would rewrite the Constitution, right? And in those elections that are then occurred a few months later, the general elections of last year, this new left did very well. social movement and more kind of independent, autonomous um, uh, list that competed did quite well, and the old political parties just were drubbed mercilessly. And so the new convention, or Constituent Assembly, started meeting a year ago to rewrite the Constitution. It took a year to do so. We can go into it later. It made a ton of mistakes along the way, but it has now settled on a draft with, I think, over 250 articles, right? But that they've agreed on, which will now be up for an approval plebiscite in 2 months. And if the Chilean public approves it, right, as you mentioned, I think it's going to be a huge victory strategically for two reasons. First, that it will rewrite the rules of the game, right, in ways that are favorable to working and popular sectors. But secondly, it's also politically, it will be a massive shot in the arm to the new government, so that the Boric administration, right, can promote successfully its reform agenda and pass a number of policies that have wide appeal. Now, in a very strange turn of events, we're looking at a situation in which the Constitution might not be approved. Chilean voters might actually, in this plebiscite in 2 months, vote to reject it, right? Which is astonishing considering everything that's happened up until now, right? And I think that's worth discussing further, both why that's the case, why right now polls show that a majority of Chileans might reject the new constitution, but also what the consequences of that would be.
Could you answer the questions there? I mean, I think this is an important thing because, constitutional reform is, a big process, and if it's initiated by mass movements in the left, it's a huge victory. But what's happening right now? I mean, why is this so? What is the content of this constitution, and why is it facing these hurdles to its introduction?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, it's going to be decisive. Um, Decisive for the reasons I just mentioned. One, if it loses, we go back to the 1980 Constitution, Pinochet's Constitution, once again, right? Which again would reaffirm all the pro-market um, policies and governance institutions which that Constitution put in place, right? So it would be a massive setback. And of course, it would be just this huge blow for this new emerging left in Chile, and it will lose the initiative. In my estimation, it will be the end, of the Boric government and experiment, less than 1 year into um, um, his tenure. So the question is why? How could that happen? Is it because, as many kind of neoliberal outlets like The Economist, right, are arguing now, and other kind of pro-market observers are saying, is it because Chileans don't like what's in it, and in particular, they don't like the social rights and protections that the new constitution would confer? In other words, is it because they're opposed to basic fundamental guarantees like guarantee of dignified work, of housing, of access to water, of access to education, and the fact that the Constitution makes the state responsible for delivering this? Is that the reason, as neoliberal think tanks and more conservative sectors of the political class in Chile are now arguing? Or is it for another reason? Well, I think it's fair to say, given everything that happened, given what propelled people onto the streets in 2019, given what pushed them to vote for a new left in the constituent elections and then in the general elections that followed a year later, and in what polls show right now that a significant majority of Chileans support the reforms that Boric has announced tax reform, public pension reform, healthcare reform, etc. Right? So, given all that, it seems to me quite obvious that Chileans now, at least according to, again, public opinion polls, are saying they might not approve the Constitution. It's clear to me that that's not because they don't want those key social reforms that offer universal social provision for masses of Chileans. I don't think that's the reason. So you have to ask why is this the case? Another possibility is that it's because the right wing, fear and hate campaign and anti-communist campaign has been really influential, and Chileans have been scared into submission. And as the right wing, through fake news, through WhatsApp, through Facebook, whatever, is convincing people that the new constitution will take their homes away, will force their children to become gay, or all these ridiculous claims. Well, I think it can't be that either, because all of those tactics were used throughout, and they weren't effective previously, right? So they might have an impact now, but then the question becomes, well, why are they effective now, whereas they hadn't been all along, right? And I think the reason that the Constitution and its the possibility of it being approved now is in question is not because of the substance of what it says. Right? It's not because suddenly Chileans have become anti-communist, or they're scared of universal social provision, or they've never liked it. I don't think that's the case. I think that they're reacting not to these reforms, but to the politics of the Constituent Assembly itself. And throughout the convention, the deliberations, the debates, the left, and mostly the independent social movement left, that did, as I mentioned earlier, really well in the elections, essentially they made fools of themselves. And in making fools of themselves, they, I think, were successful in getting Chileans to reason in the following way. Wait, if this is the left, I'm not sure this is what we want, right? But again, they're reacting to the behavior and the histrionics of this layer of the left, not to the Constitution itself. What do I mean by that? Well, there were a number of things. First of all, there was just very strange bickering and sectarianism, right, among this new crop of people that got elected into the assembly that had some experience in grassroots organizing and activism, right? Started fighting against one another instead of taking on the mass grievances of working and poor Chileans. They also, in many ways, adopted, right, a language and a discourse, a political discourse that was quite alienating, right? Using terms that people really didn't even understand, focusing their priorities on narrow identitarian concerns, right? And in doing so, right, what they did is they took the debate at the heart of the assembly, which again should have been debating the political and social future of the country. They took it in a direction that most working Chileans just weren't interested in, or didn't resonate with them at all. Things improved over the ensuing months, right? Where rather than a focus on, what are the different cultural and political identities of the Chilean polity, how do we give the earth a set of rights and treat nature the same way we treat people? I mean, we could be in favor of that, but it just, as I said, didn't resonate with working people. Once the convention got around to actually discussing the social protections and social rights that most people had been clamoring for over a decade, things improved. But by then the damage had been done. And the right wing was really effective, right, in pointing to that and saying, look, these people don't represent your interest. In fact, this is a dangerous deviation, and we're offering order. We're offering a return to normalcy, And I think that that did register with people, again, not because people reject the universal social rights and protections, but because they lost confidence in the politics of the assembly itself.
So, in a move which probably has the um, remaining surviving Chicago boys and the decaying corpses of Milton Friedman and co. And unfortunately, we still have a certain Kissinger among us, uh, rolling in their graves or at least giving them uncomfortable nights. Uh, the the country which famously Salvador Allende, the great democratic socialist experiment, was defeated through military intervention with the assistance, of course, of the CIA in the United States, has just elected a left-wing government. I mean, this is not only hugely symbolic in a massive reversal, hopefully, of the paradigm for the entire region, but the world as a whole, if we view this as one of the origin stories of neoliberalism. So how has the government been doing? What are the sort of policies brought it to power? For me, I'm just going to offer some of my own analysis from my work elsewhere, particularly in Brazil, is that one of the things that happens when you take power is, I mean, taking power and state power inevitably involves some compromises. You are going to have to make some pacts in order which things you prioritize, how you form coalitions, how you govern. Of course, Chile, as I was pointed earlier, has this constituent assembly process, which makes it a little bit different. But in some senses, what I regard as a success, at least for a left-wing government, particularly in a so-called middle to upper income country, developing country, is if you pass reforms that make it easier to govern the next time. Maybe you might lose the next election, but if you weaken your enemies, if you do something which paves the way for an easier return to power and way to govern, that itself, in some ways, is a strategic success. So, in terms of this analysis, how would you assess the current fortunes and program of this government?
Yeah, as I was saying in my early response, what happened in the Constituent Assembly ended up hurting Boric, both in his campaign, right, where he was associated with these more kind of fringe, identitarian, narrow views of the new left, right? And has hurt him since, because he entered government in a fairly weak position, right? However, you know, the the blows that he has had to withstand, right, are more conjunctural in nature. The fact of the matter is that the forces that are most have been most weakened, and I would say fatally so, in the Chilean political system, are those that ruled for over 30 years. The center left, the pro-market neoliberal center left and center right political class. They've been defeated. And so that gives Boric, even if his administration has started off with a number of mistakes and number of blows, as I mentioned, it gives him, I think, the latitude to keep moving forward. And as you said, to acquire under his belt, right, a key set of reforms we used to call non-reformist reforms, perhaps, that on the one hand strengthen popular and working sectors, and on the other hand weaken our enemies, weaken business, right? And rearrange the balance of forces, to use kind of that old language, in ways that are favorable to working and poor people. That's still very possible in Chile. What Boric has to contend with now, mostly, I think, is the emergence of this new far right, which I think poses the biggest danger to him. And what will be, I think, decisive in the short run is what happens in the plebiscite, in the constitutional plebiscite. If people reject it, if approval, as they call it, approval, loses, right? As I mentioned earlier, I think he's kind of finished. He'll be a lame duck president for the next 3 years, excuse me. And, right, the forces that will massively benefit from this loss will be this new harsh authoritarian right. But um, I think he can turn things around, and I think he will. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the new constitution will be approved by a not even a very slim majority. I think it'll end up doing somewhat well, and that will, put new wind in Boric's sails, as it were, in the sails of his government, and will push him forward with strengthened initiative and a very strong popular mandate to move ahead with his tax reform agenda, with his pension reform that will not totally eliminate private pensions, but will significantly bolster a universal public social security system, and a number of other reforms like labor reform that will strengthen unions, give unions more rights, allow them to bargain collectively on an industry-wide level, which is not now approved by Chilean law. So there are a number of things that I think, if we overcome this hurdle and the Constitution is approved, right, then it won't be smooth sailing, but we'll enjoy the opportunity to pass a number of significant reforms, which, as you said, right, will then give the strategic initiative over to the left, bolster it as a governing force. Will lose elections down the line, but it will have established itself as the political vehicle of Chileans' working masses. Something they haven't had since, as you mentioned, Allende, since 1973. So it's going to be tough. Again, the developments might prove me wrong, but I think these more conjunctural possibilities of gaining, right, through these elections and through these kind of passing these reforms, combined with what we mentioned earlier, the mix of different constituencies that are backing the government. In particular, I think it's going to be crucial, right? The power of Chile's revitalized labor movement, adding its structural leverage, right? Its social muscle to Boric's government once it clears this hurdle, right? I think it will not only allow for reforms, again, it will open the way for the emergence and the consolidation of a new type of left in Latin America.
Well, on that positive note, I have one final question for you. So I'm going to take the scope a bit more regional and move away from Chile.
Yeah.
So we've seen in every major economy, basically, Argentina, Mexico, Colombia now, which has never had a leftist government before, and which previous attempts at sort of left election campaigns resulted in massacres and essential extermination of political forces.
It might happen again. Let's hope not.
Yeah, let's hope not. But and hopefully Brazil, where Lula still enjoys a significant polling advantage over Bolsonaro, a return to the left. So if we have a region which, the left was written off not that long ago, return, especially in extremely difficult circumstances such as Mexico and Colombia, where you just campaign, you have to risk life or death.
Yeah.
This regional resurgence or return of these forces. What prospects does that mean internationally for regional collaboration, for political change, and also for those viewers in the United States who, in different conditions, are maybe a bit down and depressed and thinking things are not going so well in this moment? What lessons are there and what hopes are there for the future? Because personally, on my note, my sense is that you basically have all the major economies of not just a continent but a region that stretches all the way up towards the United States, making a turn against neoliberalism, making a turn for social rights, and making a firm rejection of a order which is only brought upon brutality and failure in governance.
Yeah. My first response is to say in a sweeping manner that all of these developments are encouraging and should be encouraged, and they should be supported. Um, anytime Pedro wins in Colombia, and the ruling class, which is a genocidal ruling class, right, is defeated, that's a great thing. If a Bolsonaro loses in Brazil, right, to a kind of triumphant return by Lula, that's a you know all things equal net, that's a good thing. If AMLO manages to kind of win upcoming elections, and this new strange, still kind of, it's not clear what kind of a left it is, but if it survives and expands and continues to challenge the old ruling elite in Mexico, these are all great things. What I would say, though, and I don't want to say this in solely a critical way, because I think it also has some advantages built in within it. I would also say that I don't necessarily share the view that we have this kind of pendulum shifting back to the left, and there's this kind of coordinated, fairly homogeneous kind of new left in power that is in a homogeneous way fighting against an authoritarian right.
I mean, I would just contend that I wouldn't say that. I would just say the kind of unique thing is that in all of these very different cases, there has been a shift. I mean, Mexico and Colombia stand out as completely divergent. Yeah, so this is the strange thing about it, is that there has been these shifts
Yeah.
without being any coordination.
Yeah.
In other
Well,
words.
yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. But what I was going to say, however, is that these different lefts are really different. Different lefts are different. These left kind of experiences throughout these countries are quite distinctive. So, for instance, in Bolivia, and you might say Argentina, perhaps Brazil, in many ways, that the mass return to power in Bolivia, that the Kirchnerist Peronist return to power in Argentina. I think what that really did was restore a balance that the pink tide had managed to install, right, with all its limitations, right. I fear, for instance, that a return of the PT to power in Brazil will restore the post-authoritarian neoliberal order pre-Bolsonaro, right, which, and I think actually helped produce Bolsonaro, has all kinds of problems, right? So I would just want to not even caution, but just point out those differences and those limitations. But even then, I think I can end on a more positive note, because that regional configuration of different lefts with all their problems, with all their weaknesses, I think actually provides a much more fertile ground for, let's say, if I'm right, the way I've characterized this new left in Chile, for instance, a new form of left politics, a new way of, left parties articulating, relating to their social bases, a new mix of constituencies backing them, for instance, right? This is all, at this point, we're exploring what this might lead to. But the fact that you have a more favorable regional political panorama, I think, can only be advantageous to, for instance, the process in Chile, the process in Colombia, which we all have to keep our eyes on to see what comes out, what happens, after Pedro's election, et cetera, et cetera. So while I wouldn't subscribe to the view that there's this return or a pink tide 2.0 in Latin America, nevertheless, I do share the view, the optimistic and encouraging view, that these individual wins for the left, and the way that they represent a weakening of certain sectors of the ruling elites in these countries are definitely promising developments.
So on that final note, I'll just make a few comments quickly. One is that this weekend saw example the type of threat from the extreme right in Brazil, where a Bolsonarista candidate went to a Pechista's sort of birthday party and just shot him dead. This is a guy who has photos with some of the Bolsonaro sons, and that just gives an indication to a guy who's famously promised to machine gun leftists. So right now, Lula sits ahead in the polls, and I'm feeling quite positive that unless there is some chicanery, there's a very good chance of his return to power. In the case of Bolivia, of course, we have seen the coup plotters end up legally punished, which is kind of incredible for Latin America on the right. And most miraculously of all, Colombia. I mean, if a country in which if you a activist of any sort, you risk chainsaws and torture, can elect a government. I mean, the United States could always take the example, things could be much worse, and there's always hope. So on that note, we're going to end, and I would like to thank you for your time and your insights in Chile.
Thank you. It was fun talking. Appreciate it.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.